Welcome back to the Law Talks with Toks series, LTWT. I'm your host, Toks Hussain. After a long day at work, I decided to kick back and sip a cup of chai tea. And of course, enjoy some Netflix. I went to the documentary section and noticed a documentary about pornography trending. Now, I bring this up because in today's LTWT episode, I had the privilege of speaking to a young Australian lawyer and activist named Noelle Martin. When Noelle was 17, she accidentally discovered that her selfie had been photoshopped into porn images and distributed across porn sites. Noelle decided to speak out against such image-based abuse, which in itself led to more vicious online attacks. Her action has subsequently become a major factor behind recently enacted laws that make circulation of non-consensual intimate images illegal in Australia. She now uses her voice to raise global awareness about technology-facilitated abuse, in particular image-based sexual abuse and deepfakes and related matters. Noelle was awarded Young Western Australian of the Year in 2019, and also that year made the 2019 Forbes 30 Under 30 Asia list. In today's episode, we talk about her campaign, the legal and social issues related to online sexual abuse, and there's a special treat for you. Stay tuned. Noelle Martin, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Welcome to Law Talks with Toks. How are you today?
Thank you for having me. I'm well, thank you.
Awesome. So why don't we start this episode with you giving us just a summary of how you came to a career in the law?
Well, I have always, for as long as I remember, have wanted to be a lawyer. I grew up in a family where my father studied law whilst I was, a child. And I remember going to one of his law tutorials very young. And I think I loved debating. I loved critical thinking. I loved, thinking on my feet. And so from a very, very early age, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer.
Let's talk a little bit more about your background. So you campaign for better policies and legal regulatory responses to the global issue of online-based sexual abuse, in particular the non-consensual sharing of intimate images and deep fakes. Could you just give us the background story to your campaign, please?
Right. Yeah, so I discovered that predators around the world were sharing images of me that they had taken from social media, and they had posted that onto pornographic sites without my consent, and they had then edited or manipulated or doctored those images into intimate material, and because of the fact that there weren't any specific laws that dealt with this issue in Australia, I, after a number of years, found it within myself to speak out and to fight for law reform here in Australia. And over a period of time, we did see some successful law reform activity here. And it's now criminalised to distribute intimate images without consent, whether they be altered or not, and whether they be images or videos or not. And, as a consequence of speaking out and fighting for law reform, that's kind of put a greater target on my back for the perpetrators to continue to target me. And so over time, they escalated that from images to now a deep fake video. Now there's a whole number of other implications that come with advancements in technology and this kind of abuse toward predominantly women.
Well, thank you for sharing your story, and it's a real shame, what has happened. But I obviously applaud you for the excellent campaign you've done, certainly in raising awareness of this very important issue. Um, I wonder, though, if you could just give us an overview of the relevant legal framework in Australia,
Mm,
because I think it's very helpful to understand what was the framework previously, why it was perhaps
mm,
inadequate, and
mm.
perhaps the contribution that your campaign made in raising awareness, which ultimately contributed to legal reform in Australia.
Yeah, so prior to the law reform efforts in Australia in relation to this issue, there were no specific laws that dealt with the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, the non-consensual recording or taking of intimate images, and the non-consensual threatening to record or take intimate images, images or videos. And so you kind of had a patchwork of different kinds of laws that were being used to apply to circumstances such as this, breach of confidence, misuse of telecommunications, carriage service, but those weren't uniquely formulated for these specific instances. And so we really needed that specific legislation, not only as an educative tool, but also a specific deterrent for society, and to empower victims to know that this specific conduct is against the law, and there are avenues for justice for you if you experience this. And so we desperately needed the specific legislation that dealt with it. Now, what we have in Australia is that in the significant majority of states and territories, except for one, it is illegal to distribute intimate images without consent. You have criminal laws in those states and territories that deal with that issue. And in some states, it's punishable by imprisonment by potentially up to 3 years with a fine. And all across Australia at the federal level, you also have laws, and you have civil penalties, and you also have criminal penalties. And the criminal penalties are quite similar to the state-based legislation. But when it comes to the civil penalties, what you do have is a government regulator that exists in Australia that's specifically there for helping Australians online and making sure that they're safe. And so there's a scheme whereby people who find themselves victims of this kind of abuse can report it to them, and the agency will, on behalf of the victim, go and remove that material shared without consent. And the regulator has the power to issue fines for individuals who do that, or even social media companies who fail to comply with a kind of direction to remove that content. And the fines can be quite significant if they fail to remove that material. And so that's kind of the system. Does it work? Is another question, but that's the brief overview of how it works.
Thank you. And I just want to gauge the practical difficulties which somebody might have if they want to seek redress. So you've indicated that there's separate systems, certainly on the state level. Do you feel that creates more difficulties and inconsistencies? So, for example, if somebody wanted redress in a particular state, the outcome might be significantly different if they were to seek redress in another state. And consequently, do you feel that it would be helpful if there was a universal, uniform approach or law to deal with this issue?
Well, the laws that we have in this area are relatively new. And so there's not a lot of research into how it really affects individual victims in terms of the inconsistencies between the laws that we have here. What I can say is that there are practical difficulties when it comes to perpetrators who aren't in Australia at all, and actually trying to hold them to account. And it's very difficult to do that, especially when they're in a different jurisdiction. And I'm certainly not aware of any instance where someone was a perpetrator overseas and, you know, were somehow brought to justice in a kind of an Australian context. So we definitely have a problem with the borderless and global nature of the internet and tackling this issue. You know, there might be inconsistencies between the laws that we have in Australia, but overall, I think they're generally quite similar. And we do have a federal law that deals with this issue, and that's also generally speaking quite similar. But I think the practical difficulties that come with this and tackling this come from the global nature of this abuse. The fact that perpetrators can be overseas, the fact that you've got, you know, the ability for material to proliferate on the internet very quickly, very rapidly, and it being really difficult to take things down. And, you know, in some cases, as it was in my case, the removal process that I had taken to in the beginning was completely futile. Things can be permanent on the internet once they're there, and you never know where it could end up or how it could, you know, affect your life in years or months or weeks. So it's a very problematic environment in terms of dealing with this issue, because I really think that no one country can tackle this. There really has to be a global response, because it's just simply not good enough that someone from halfway across the world can completely ruin another person's life and then get away with it. So, and there's also difficulties when it comes to a victim knowing who's responsible and a victim not knowing who's responsible. Because when you have circumstances where a victim knows who's responsible, there's, I think, a greater likelihood of holding that person to account. But we have, you know, the big World Wide Web, and when you don't know actually who's responsible, it can be really difficult to actually find out who they are at all. So there's definitely enforcement problems and issues that we have to deal with.
I think you've made a reference to a very important point, which is, you know, the global nature of the internet and the fact that there aren't any global regulatory schemes to regulate the internet, and that's perhaps for very good reason. Obviously, you have to bear in mind the cultural factors as well. You know, certainly when it comes to hate speech, you know, the European model might not particularly work in the American model. And this is something which creates real difficulties, but still needs to be very well addressed. But if we could perhaps talk about the UK just for a little bit. So the relevant provision when it comes to what's called revenge porn is actually in the Criminal Justice and Court Act 2015. So what it does is that it creates a specific offence in England and Wales for distributing a private sexual image of somebody without their consent, and this has to be with the intention of causing them distress. So as I've said, it's colloquially known as revenge porn, and the maximum custodial sentence is 2 years. Do you feel that this 2-year sentence is sufficient? And also, what's the scheme in Australia? What's the maximum sentence for these types of offences?
So do I think 2 years is appropriate? I don't think that's enough. I think that is really, really low, but I feel as if sentencing is already, there's a low bar for a lot of sentences. And even if you do have the 2-year, maximum, what's really going to be used in sentencing in practice is going to be, I think, a lot lower than that. And I think there is a problem because, generally speaking, I don't believe that a lot of people fully understand and appreciate what this kind of abuse does. There's a lot of criticism in terms of, this is just online, like what really could it have done to you? Or, it's not on the lower end of all kinds of sexual crimes. And people don't really fully understand how it is absolutely life-shattering and devastating. And, for me, it's been almost 10 years of this happening to me, where perpetrators have escalated their attacks on me, and not just created one or distributed one intimate image. They've created a whole persona and a whole false identity of me without my consent. And so I don't believe if they were ever brought to justice that 2 years would be sufficient to actually adequately hold them accountable and proportionately hold them accountable.
Briefly, what is deepfake and why is it important to this conversation?
Well, essentially, it's a computer-generated video or audio that uses artificial intelligence and can create something that is, almost indistinguishable from what is real, what is not, and it's quite unbelievable what people can create using this technology. So that's where things have progressed.
Okay. And do you feel that the survivors of this type of abuse, a victim of a deepfake video, for example, do they find it difficult to remove such content from the hosting sites? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, just for context, there's been research done that says around 96% of deepfakes are pornographic, and approximately 100% of those are of women. So people are using this technology to violate women, and that is a huge problem when it comes to this, because we can talk a lot about the implications of deepfakes on national security, on notions of truth and democracy and all other types of implications. But fundamentally, the most significant implication of this is the human and gendered implications.
This is Law Talks with Toks, with your host, Toks Hussain.
Welcome back to Law Talks with Toks. We have, of course, Noelle Martin, and we are just about to talk about the social impact of online-based sexual abuse. So you've made reference to how this can have terrible consequences on the survivors. Do you want to give us perhaps an idea as to what type of impact the victims, what type of impact it has on victims, perhaps?
Well, I think the impacts are lifelong. They take the form of emotional distress and violation at seeing yourself in such a way, or seeing yourself out there, and that's incredibly significant to impacts on a person's employability or maintaining employment because of assumptions that could be made about you in the workplace, or assumptions that could be made about you that might deter employers actually taking you on. Educational disruption, the capacity for your education and your studies to be impacted because of what's happening. A sense of hopelessness and powerless, especially where you don't know who's responsible, especially where you don't know, why they're doing what they're doing, and the fact that they might not be held accountable. So there are just a range of consequences for victims. Obviously victim blaming and slut shaming and the reception that people have towards this issue, maybe police not taking it seriously. Maybe this is something that might affect you in different ways forever, because who knows when material might pop up again? Who knows when it might, come to the fore, or when someone might find it. And so it's very scary living under the cloud of this happening.
No, I appreciate that. And thanks for just giving us more of a very human perspective, because when we talk about these issues, I think it's very easy, isn't it, to forget the actual impact that it can have on the survivors of such abuse. Now, still on the matter of impact and social issues, of course, we're talking today about online-based sexual abuse in form of deep fakes, etc. But one particular form of sexual abuse and sexual harassment that has gained traction in recent years, of course, is the Me Too movement, which I just want to talk about rather quickly. So, Noel, it would be helpful to get your take as to why you think we are witnessing this type of revolution against sexual harassment. I think it's a great thing that's happened. So why do you think this has happened? And why now at this particular time?
I mean, I think that it's about time that something like this happened. It was so overdue, and women all over the world had just had enough. I mean, people talked about this, behind closed doors all the time, and it was certainly criminalized, and it was an issue that societies had to tackle. But in terms of having some sort of international reckoning with this issue, we hadn't seen that before. And it was just, I think, it had reached a point where people just had enough. And it was no longer okay that perpetrators were getting away with what they were doing. And so I think it just had reached that point.
It's remarkable, really, and unfortunately, even in the legal profession, for many years, there's been strong evidence of sexual harassment and abuse, and the regulators, of course, still trying to tackle this issue. So it's good that we are seeing, in your words, a reckoning when it comes to this particular matter. But I think also that there's a further complexity, isn't there, because of the approaches taken when it comes to the Me Too movement. On the one hand, you have the suggestion that you should believe everybody who comes up with an allegation. On the other hand, there's the thought that suggests you should at least take the allegation seriously. Then again, there's also the other matter, which is you need to consider who is being accused of anything. And of course, in today's world, where there's a risk of trial by media, I think that what we've seen in recent times is a danger where the presumption of innocence is easily lost.
A British woman is going to prison for 8.5 years over false rape allegations that 3 men say caused them to attempt suicide. Eleanor Williams from Cumbria was found guilty of perverting the course of justice in January. One man she accused says her lives made his life hell on earth. Another spent 73 days in prison after he was charged with rape. Social services told another man that they'd had 60 anonymous tip-offs saying he wasn't safe with his own children. Before they were revealed as lies, Eleanor Williams' claims sparked protests in her hometown of Barrow-in-Furness. She posted a Facebook photo of injuries she said were inflicted by an abuser, but prosecutors say she'd actually hit herself with a hammer.
What are your thoughts in this particular issue and the risk involved, which I've just tried to identify?
I think it's a very complex issue, and there are a number of different factors that have to be considered because, I do believe in the presumption of innocence, and I think that that's vital to any kind of criminal justice system, democratic in a democratic society, and I think we do have to think about trial by media. And that not just in cases of sexual abuse and harassment, but in any kind of in anything, we see people who might say the wrong thing or do something, and there's this pack mentality or mob mentality that targets them. So. And in different circumstances and different cases, I think it's absolutely justified. Where people, especially public figures, everyone has a right to say what they think about those issues, and there's platforms for people to do it. So on the one hand, you do have this right that people have, and on the other, you've got issues to do with whether it's justified or not, and this pack mentality that happens as well that comes with that. But in terms of false allegations, I think there's been research done into the statistics on this matter, and overall, it's such a small amount of allegations that are false in the scheme of things. And so you're talking about such a small set of circumstances in our society. But coming from someone who's spoken out about sexual abuse, whether it be just this particular form of abuse or not, I know that you really, really do not seek to benefit from speaking out. You, I think, seek to lose more than you gain. You put yourself out there to be absolutely, ripped apart by people from the world, and people will rip you apart, and people do rip you apart. People attack your credibility and your character. People attack the way you look, and say comments like, why would they want to do that to you, because of the way you look. You are absolutely ripped apart if you dare to speak out about the abuse that you might have experienced. And so coming from that lens, when I see people who have spoken out in the Me Too movement, I do believe that.
Really, as part of your campaign, you have spoken to politicians across the world. Is that right?
I've spoken to politicians across Australia.
It's still quite a big deal, I think.
Very grateful.
So that's on the local level, but let's think about internationally. Is there anybody who you feel you'd have wanted to talk to, particularly about some of the things you care about, say deep fakes? Is there anybody in particular you felt, oh, I'd really like to talk to that person?
I would love to talk to Barack Obama. That would be really great. Yes, he would be someone that I would love to talk to about this.
Yeah, and yes, actually, he was affected by deep fake, wasn't he? Yeah,
that's right.
Well, it so turns out that we actually do have Barack Obama on the show. So congratulations. I'm just going to bring Obama on the show now. Hello, Noel. How are you doing?
I'm very well. How are you?
Doing very well, thank you. I read about your campaign in recent times, and I got to say that you're a really, really inspirational young person.
Thank you very much. I think you are too.
This is a conversation I've had with Michelle quite a few times. Just how technology, which is supposed to be for good, can be used for quite terrible purposes. Now, I like a good movie, and I like a good film on Netflix. And sometimes this technology is quite good for CGI, etc. But we got to think, what's the best way for us to have this technology in a way that can be used for good purposes, but at the same time too find a way to properly regulate. And so I think that that's a challenge that your generation has got to have to confront. And you got any thoughts on the best way to do it?
We have to collaborate as a global community and as appreciating that this kind of abuse and tackling what happens on the internet and things that happen online have to be tackled together. Countries around the world, law enforcement around the world, and so I think moving forward, if we truly want to deal with this issue, there has to be some sort of global collaboration.
You're doing a great job, and you should certainly keep it up. Can we make a difference? Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sadly, we have reached the end of the episode, and I can honestly say this has been a very interesting conversation, and certainly I benefited from the additional conversation you had with the extra guest on the show. This has been Noelle Martin on Law Talks with Toks. It's truly been a very inspirational, a very powerful talk. So again, I thank you for sharing your experiences and also your insights in this very important matter, which is of course of legal and societal importance. So thank you once again for being on the show. And again, for me, I'm Toks Hussain, and this has been Law Talks with Toks. Thank you and take care.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Law Talks with Toks. If you enjoyed it, make sure you subscribe to my channel, Toks Hussain, share and leave a comment. Ciao.